the interesting thing about the way this gallery came about was that Linda was a Mrs. Goodman, but fairly briefly, and she later, by the time she moved the gallery into this newer building and eventually retired, she was a Mrs. Givon, Givon. So she's more remembered now as Mrs. Givon, but people would say, why Goodman Gallery? And were you related to Marion Goodman? But she and Marion both said, no, we were both once a Mrs. Goodman. But the Goodman men weren't so good, and they went in another direction, and we had then somebody else instead. And actually, Linda's husband, Tony Goodman, is an amazing gentleman who's still around and an art collector. And they had a really interesting and a very fine relationship and remained great friends. And his daughter, by his second marriage, actually became a colleague and eventually an artist in our gallery roster. And she has dealers in Belgium and in Copenhagen, and she's become a quite world-renowned artist as well, Frances Goodman. So the name has kind of kept the sense of history with the country, because when Linda then worked in the Grosvenor Gallery in London, when she was married to her first husband, who was Dr. Miller, and had her 2 children, and that marriage broke up, and she moved back to South Africa with her children and decided to open a gallery, having seen particular African art, including Soweto sculptors, who basically didn't really have much option of anywhere to show in South Africa. Under the apartheid period, there were a handful of artists of different races who showed in a house gallery in Linksfield in Johannesburg that belonged to a German-born gentleman named Egon Gunther. And Egon was perhaps the first dealer to try and begin a process of having artists from all walks of life and all creeds and colours in the country to have a kind of a bond and a kinship and work, if not together, then work in the same vein and the same gallery group. And he was somewhat older, and his wife became ill, and he more or less gave up his gallery. But Linda took on some of those artists and then some people who came along with them. And the idea for Goodman Gallery in her mind was that instead of some of these really very accomplished black artists in South Africa sending their work to London or to New York, that it be exhibited and people in South Africa begin to see art from all the communities of the country. And so she always spoke of the gallery has to become a safe place for people to meet and to learn to know one another and understand each other's approach to art and what art now means for a country like South Africa in the late 20th century, or the latter half. And she began first some of the prominent white artists of the country who also had never really been very together were the Afrikaans speakers and the English speakers. But she tried to find people who were interested in international modern movements and who were people open to a dialogue and learning about other artists. So our initial, and I say our, I was born in Zambia, but by the time I came to the country in the middle 60s, the gallery hadn't just opened just a year or two later. And I joined the gallery in 1982. So it's 42 years this year. And it's been a long and very interesting road. And it has had many challenges, because South Africa has had many challenges, but it's had a great deal of interest and privilege and access to amazing people and amazing things being involved in a history like this one. The history of the culture and the history of South Africa and the history of our artists in this gallery are absolutely indelibly intertwined. By the time 1970, 69, 70 came, she had already taken on a couple of artists who were, shall we say, persons of interest to the security police, black artists who were making very powerful work that was political statements. And it began a period that went on right into the 80s, where occasionally government officials from the Bureau of State Security, read BOSS, not in Hugo Boss, but in BOSS as the Bureau, people would arrive. There was one artist named Sam Nhlengethwa, who was one of the grandmasters of the Soweto Sculpture School. He had exhibited with the, and she'd first seen his work in London at the Goodman Gallery. And also Sidney Khumalo. But Ezra made very fine, detailed, but very contemporary drawing style. And he was a member of the Black Consciousness movement, which was known. So the authorities kept an eye on him. And he published some series of works, a handful of prints only ever, but mostly these incredibly detailed drawings and then sculpture made from them. And those drawings very often concerned the lives and work of leaders such as Steve Biko. He became famous for making works which were in subject to look at, the chicken and the egg, and which comes first. And if you chop off the head of the chicken but it's already laid an egg, you're not going to stop the revolutionary process. That was the profundity, the meaning behind the works. But when the works were taken to court to ask the judge to have them banned and declared banned, the judiciary did play their part at a time in South Africa. The judge said, this is nonsense. I see ugly drawings of chickens and eggs. There is no mention of the name Biko, and there is nothing of that in the title. So, you can't ban them. You pack them up, put the men in the brown nylon suits, and pack them up and take them back to the ladies' gallery. And Linda stood up and said, Your Worship, if you don't mind, we'd rather not have those men back in the gallery. We'll take them back ourselves. So she and the artist brought them back, and they were hung back in the gallery. And it was one of a number of similar things. We represented some people who were extraordinary and who wanted to make work that aspired to a different future. They wanted to make work that might, in the case of Sidney Khumalo, be an angel on the head of a pin, a large bronze, but its feet sort of concentrated on this one little point, but its wings cut at the back, not long wings, but sort of cut off in half, and with a mournful face. And this would be the angel contemplated in 1973 at New Year. Was the first work that he made in that year, and its arms were up, like in a plea, let the people be free. And it was called An Anguished Angel. But there were elections after the 76 student riots, and there were, of course, the elections for the first democratic South Africa in 1994. And what's been interesting to me is that Goodman Gallery has represented a very wide range of artists, because that was how Linda saw she could do this. So we did 2 exhibitions from the Picasso family's inheritances from Pablo. Jean-Claude Picasso and Paloma Picasso allowed us to have work to exhibit and sell in South Africa. We, by way of giving back to the country, also put that show at the National Gallery in Cape Town, and then exhibited and sold here in Johannesburg. Mm-hmm. But she would use, as she said, if we do 2 big international shows a year, she had built good relationships abroad. We showed in those days people like Mimo Palladino and Sandra Pia out of Italy, some of the Spanish artists like Antoni Tapier's, British artist Henry Moore, whose daughter Mary married a Cape Town advocate, Raymond Donofsky, and Sidney Khumalo had gone to meet and experience some of the kind of casting procedures in large bronzes when he was able to travel. So over time, I suppose, the arts community, and that includes people working in music and dance and sport, these became gradually the shifts that started seeing people get together. And it was about, well, if that person is such a great runner, why can't they represent the country in some competition? There was a boycott. Some people broke the boycott, that caused problems, but the boycott and the economic boycott eventually were powerful tools in changing the minds of South Africans that actually they had to find a way of living together in a better and more equitable way. We have a long tradition of protest art. So the kind of young black artists who might have been protesting apartheid and who were protesting against the violence and the terrible deaths of Stephen Biko, death of Hector Peterson in Soweto, the young child shot in the 76 riots, today would be protesting about government secrecy, about missing funds, or why some perhaps powerful person in the cabinet has been suspended with full pay and named in commissions of inquiry and even threatened with suspension from the government or the party, but never charged and never arrested. So art is continuing with these traditions of really trying to critique society and open different doors. And that's valuable.
My name is Sam Nhlengethwa. I was born in Painville Springs, east of Johannesburg. And and I also grew up in a township in Rotanda where my grandmother was brought up by my grandmother, my mother's mother. And then, and in this house, it's I moved from the family, which is about 25 k's from here. My entire siblings are still there. So I just bought a house here with my family, my wife and daughter.
Would you like to tell us how you became a painter?
It's quite a long story because, I started at the primary school. I was in the entire school. I was the only one who sort of like enjoyed drawing and copying things and draw them. And now recently, a friend of mine who I schooled with at the primary was telling some people, said, "This man, we never thought he would be where he is because he was the only one at our school who liked drawing." So and 1976, I was at high school, and then that's when the June riots started, and we were sort of like in and out of classrooms because our teachers were sort of worried about us scattering in the streets because the police were shooting. And one of our teachers, in our class said, "Okay, just draw anything that you wish to do." So I used to sit next to the window, and then I opened the window, then I started to do the garden. And later the teacher was looking at different drawings of the students, and then he said to me, "You must consider doing art because I have never seen a youngster who can capture perspective the way you have done it. So consider that." So his name was Mr. Bilankulu. He's the one who really made me think about studying art. And then I dropped at high school, and then I went to go and study art.
How old were you?
I was 22. I went to study art in KZN in Natal at a place, center called Rock Street Art Center. We had people who were doing pottery, I'm talking about the people of the village doing pottery, doing tapestries. And from time to time, we'll be asked as students, art students, to sort of like design something and give it to the people who are weaving or give it to people who are doing pottery. So it was like kind of like collaborating. And I also studied under the late Bill Ainsley. He ran a center called the Art Foundation. I must say, it was during the tough times. So, but Bill Ainsley made me to realize that I can't paint all white people with the same brush. He was like a father figure to us as students, and he taught us many things, and he was kind-hearted as well. So it was Bill Ainsley who made me come out of this trapped kind of fear of white people. So I started to open up, and then I really enjoyed working under Bill Ainsley. I think I regard myself as someone who brings awareness to the society with everything that I do. During apartheid days, police were killing people, and but I never stopped painting about people who were going to church, people who were getting married, because we those lifestyle or normalities in our society never sort of stopped happening. People would play soccer, people would listen music under apartheid, and then in future, now because we are under democracy, I can still do whatever is happening, whether it's something that is like reminding us of apartheid, like the Marikana story where people were shot, and I did a paintings about that. And then the essence is I'm like Steve Biko, because Steve Biko said, I write what I like and I paint what I like. 1994 came with various blessings for me, because that was 1994 when I decided that I want to resign, because I used to work for television for 13 years. I was a studio set designer, and then I handed my resignation to my supervisor, and they said to me, yes, but please do us a favor, just design one more set. Why? Because the office had about 13 designers, and I was the only black designer. So they felt that it would be appropriate for me as a black person to design a set for Mandela's first debate with then President F.W. de Klerk. So I bowed out at the SABC, having designed a set for Nelson Mandela, and it gave me the chance to meet Mandela. And I became independent after that, did the set for Mandela. I won the Young Award, National Young Award under Standard Bank, and we had our democracy. So 94 for me was very exciting.